Good morning. I am coming to you this morning from the room in which one of our legislative committees is meeting. This is where my committee, the committee that I'm on, the Ordained Ministry Committee is meeting. I'm standing in the delegate area. You see that we have, I just wanted to show you what it looked like. And I'm sorry, I'm used to my phone being the other way and the camera being on this side. So we sit at conference tables, which is really the same as when we're in plenary. And then in the back section, you can see behind you can see the black curtain there is where observers are able to sit. We have not yet had anything like enough observers to fill that spot, but we certainly have had a number of observers that come and go. And then you see the booths for the translators for the official languages there in the back. I'm going to talk about how we do subcommittee work. Let me just turn a little bit and show you then what the front of our space looks like. And so we have a stage, a dais for the chair and the vice chair and the secretary who sit up there when we're doing our work. And then we also have screens when we're doing our work to make sure we know what petition we're on and those sorts of things to show us when we're doing votes. We do use voting devices here in the committee room, the same as we do in the plenary session. They're different devices. We've got our voting cards that we stick in the devices. We take the cards with us. We leave the devices. So the devices stay in the room that they're in. We also use our translation devices. So again, because you have the booths in the back, so everybody can listen to whatever's being said in their preferred language. We also have some staff working with general conference folks, many of them volunteers. We're so grateful for them, who help make sure the paperwork gets done. And then every group has a parliamentarian. Some of the legislative committees are sharing parliamentarians. Mine has one of our bishops, Bishop Hagia, who is serving as our parliamentarian. And so that's great. He's with us all the time. When we go into legislative committees, which we did for all of yesterday afternoon and until our 6:30 p.m. break, when we go into legislative committees and then go into subcommittees, at least my subcommittee, some other committees have not gone into subcommittee yet, but we did yesterday to begin processing some of the hopefully simpler, I don't know that easy is the right word, but just kind of simpler pieces that we're like, okay, let's try to get it done. Let's get some momentum, get done as much as we can. And we have 4 subcommittees on the Ordained Ministry Legislative Committee. And so we had 3 other small rooms that are in the hallway here. And so we went into those rooms and then one group met here. It's one of the things that's interesting too, when we go into those rooms, of course, we've got to still have translators. And so, whereas here we can use the listening devices, in those rooms, at least the subcommittee that I was in, we had translators who came and sat. The group that I was in, we had 3 persons who spoke French. And so we had 2 translators who sat with them, and we all worked together to make sure that everybody understood what we were processing and that everybody had the opportunity to speak. So that's a little bit about legislative committees. I tried to make a video last night. The sound went completely sideways. So let me give you a summary. I posted a video at the end of our morning plenary yesterday. But the big news, and if you're on any email list, you've probably seen that the petition that would make, well, there are five of the 8 petitions for regionalization that originated and then came to us from the Standing Committee on Central Conferences. 5 of those petitions passed, including the one with constitutional amendments that really updates the Book of Discipline to make us regionalized, to allow all regions to be able to contextualize their ministry in the midst of our connectional system. The first 4 had been presented previously on the consent calendar. Now, there are a number of rules for why and how and which things can get on the consent calendar. If an item, some of those are, if an item comes out of committee, it is supported widely, like almost unanimously, then it can go on the consent calendar. The consent calendar is then printed so that delegates can see what's on the consent calendar. And then it's printed in the morning, 3 p.m. that day. You can, if you get 20 signatures on the appropriate form, you can remove something off the consent calendar. You would want to remove something off the consent calendar if you want to be able to debate it on the floor, because all of the items on the consent calendar, and you'll start to see now that legislative committees are doing their work, long consent calendars. So items on the consent calendar, which have been supported in their committee, again, meeting the qualifications, simply as a whole, like the whole list on that consent calendar, get voted up or down, yes or no, and it's not debatable. So you would want to pull something off if you want to debate it. Some items can't go on the consent calendar. That was true with petition 1, that constitutional amendment piece, which we did process yesterday, and I'll say a word about. But I was kind of surprised. I don't know. I mean, I think it has been hard to know what to anticipate this general conference. Let me say that. I was pleasantly surprised to see that none of the 4 consent calendar regionalization items from the Standing Committee on Central Conferences had been pulled off yesterday. And so all 4 were on the consent calendar. There are actually 2 sections of the consent calendar, one dealing with disciplinary items, the other dealing with items that are not disciplinary, and nothing had been pulled off. And so really at the very beginning of our plenary yesterday, we right away approved 4 of the 8 petitions that are part of the package of regionalization from the Standing Committee. Yesterday, we actually began with a wonderful and powerful worship led by our Baltimore Washington Conference Bishop, Bishop Latrell Miller Easterling. And it was in concert with our observation of Thursdays in Black in cooperation with the World Council of Churches, shining light on violence against sexual violence, domestic partner violence, violence around the world, often against women, but but against all of the ways too that the church has been silent. Bishop Easterling spoke to the ways that too often the church has been silent and has been complicit in violence against those victims. So I encourage you, I'm not going to try at all to summarize my bishop's sermon. So please go online and watch the video yesterday. It was a very, very powerful sermon, wonderful music, music I know that Bishop Easterling loves, that was part of that service. And then we went into plenary at 8:45. That's the same schedule we're going to have today. We're beginning with worship at 8 a.m. We'll go into plenary at 8:45. Yesterday, we heard a wonderful presentation from some of our annual conference lay leaders as part of the laity address. And we received administrative reports. We'll do that every day. Things about things from all of the administrative committees, monitoring reports, all of those are part of generally the beginning of our work so that we know how we're going to be moving through our work together. As we continued through the morning, we were scheduled to break late morning and go into a little bit of committee work before lunch. But we knew that the conference knew that there were these calendar items that had come from the Standing Committee on Central Conference. So the Standing Committee on Central Conference is a standing committee. So they'd already met. That's why they had items that got on the consent calendar. And then there were some of those items that were not, they're just things that couldn't go on this consent calendar because of our rules. And one of those was, it was calendar item 22, but it was the first of 8 petitions dealing with regionalization. That's those constitutional amendments. Again, as I said earlier, it could not go on the consent calendar because it was constitutional amendments to basically regionalize the church by making those updates to our United Methodist Constitution. And so there was a motion to suspend the rules to extend our session, right? So we approve the agenda every day. And so to change our agenda, we have to suspend our rules because we've already passed the agenda. So we did that. The motion was to suspend our rules to continue the work on all of the standing committee's pieces. Now, I saw 7 of those. The bishop at one point said 4. Anyway, we certainly knew that there were more than just the one petition around regionalization. We started then, when we moved to that work, that was approved, the motion to continue working. We started by working on a petition, a request from the United Methodist Churches in Eurasia to become autonomous. That's essentially to leave the United Methodist Church and to form a separate church. This has happened before. It's always been part of our book of discipline that United Methodists outside the United States can say, you know what, we want to be independent. And there are a number of times and ways that has happened. A number of churches, for example, in Central and Latin America and South America that have become autonomous. And so we certainly grieve the loss of that particular institutional connection, but that vote was very gracious, went really quite smoothly. It was approved, and their bishop offered just a really powerful and, again, gracious speech as we close that time. The next piece we moved to was petition 1 of 8 of regionalization, those constitutional amendments. And we went through the debate. There were speeches for, speeches against, and then we voted, and it passed. It needed a 2/3 majority to pass. It passed with 78.13%, which is a significant margin. Now, that really was the most significant piece, like in terms of our polity around regionalization. And you may have seen people online say, regionalization has passed. And we're not done yet. Again, there are 8 petitions. There are 3 remain. So if you'll remember, I said we had 4 that were on the consent calendar that were approved. The constitutional amendments were approved. There are 3 remaining petitions that deal with regionalization under the plan from the Standing Committee on Central Conferences. All 3 of these are coming through the Conferences Committee, and all 3 of them deal with really enabling legislation to form a U.S. regional conference. And those are petitions 5, 6, and 7. So we still need to receive those to approve the whole package. But wonderfully encouraging. It is such an important time for us as United Methodists to be able to contextualize. And as the Standing Committee presented earlier in General Conference, one of the things that really stuck out to me, I think is a great way of talking about why we need regionalization, is that our Constitution was written at a time when we were a U.S. church with mission outposts, but we are truly a global church now. And regionalization allows us to be that structurally. I certainly was aware yesterday in ordained ministry, as we were working through some of the legislation in subcommittee, dealing with rules around categories of ordained ministry that some of our central conferences simply do not have. And so these delegates are having to not only understand the legislation, but make sure but understand some categories of ministry. So, for example, deacons, which deacons are transitional deacons in at least many African conferences, whereas we have ordained deacons in the United States, and in some, for example, I heard yesterday from another delegate in Europe, they do have ordained deacons. And so it's an example of the ways that at General Conference, often we spend so much time dealing with legislation and matters that really just pertain to the U.S. church. And so regionalization is such an exciting opportunity to be able to truly reflect who we are as a global church. Now, once we'd gone through working on that petition, it was lunchtime, it was 12:30. So we actually didn't finish all of the Standing Committee's calendar items, but Bishop Malone, who was presiding at that point, encouraged the conference that perhaps that was a move to make. I think we were all ready to do that. If she hadn't made that motion, I think a number of us would have tried to find a legislative way to do that. But then we went to lunch and then moved immediately into legislative committees. We were in legislative committee for the rest of the day yesterday. And again, until 6:30, when our session is, we've got like a hard stop most days. Tomorrow we'll go into the evening. But most days we have that hard stop. There were a lot of exciting things that happened in legislative committees. As I mentioned earlier, in rooms just like this, petitions that move along some of the other key priorities. So you probably have heard the 3 R's, regionalization. So we've got some wonderful momentum on regionalization. And there was some really good work coming out of legislative committees around the revised social principles, which have made it through committee and will come to the floor in the coming days, removal of restrictive language. And so this is really wonderful work. But we still have more than a week left. And so for those of us who were at or aware of in Tampa in 2012, that was just one example of the ways that until we're gavelled out, the work is not done. We keep going. And so we want to make sure to continue to be steady, continue to hold around these really important priorities of regionalization, removal of the restrictive language, and passage of the revised social principles, all of these that help us move forward into the church that God has called us to be. We have already heard a presentation from the chair of our General Council on Finance and Administration. And so we're going to be dealing in the coming days with the budget. That's also a really significant piece. And there's a lot of other legislation. These 3 priorities are not the only things that our legislative committees are working through. And so thank you for your prayers for our delegates. We give a special thanks. I give a special thanks. I know all of us do, to everybody who's making this possible, for those who are staffing our legislative committees and plenary, those from all of the agencies of the United Methodist Church who are here. The convention center staff have just been absolutely Wonderful. And we're looking forward to a great day ahead. Again, the schedule for today, we're going to begin shortly with opening worship at 8 a.m. and move into plenary at 8:45. Those things should be live streamed. But then late morning, around 10:30 or so, we'll be moving into legislative committees. We'll have a break and we'll move in. Legislative committees will not be live streamed. You can follow United Methodist News for lots of information. If you really want to follow specific legislation, the dailychristianadvocate.org website has, I think it's .org and not .com. You'll search it, you'll figure it out. It'll either look right or it won't. If you have a paid account, you can track legislation by legislation, and that's really updated pretty real time. So even when I was in legislative committee yesterday, there were some pieces that we were connected to pieces in other committees. And in one case, we were able to see that the other committee had already approved the piece that we were referring to. So that's really helpful. Delegates have access to that. Again, if you're not a delegate, you can pay to have access. But you can also follow along with United Methodist News Service and your annual conference news agencies for updates on what's happening. So we're going to go into session soon, and then we will all be in committee rooms like this as we do our work this afternoon.